Hi, everybody. So we're going to get started talking about everybody's character. And in this particular um, segment of the assignment, what you were doing was adding a background and some text. Um, so we're going to talk about the background and text today, of course, but we'll also continue to talk about the character and what we can do to make it more, you know, just bring it to life a little bit more, anything we can do. But I would say that primarily um, at this stage, finding a good background is actually, it takes a little bit of playing around and experimenting. So uh, don't be surprised if you have to keep playing around to find a good one. I find that it's really the most important part at this phase. There's a number of reasons. So actually, I brought the examples. You've probably looked at these examples before. I've had them posted to the classroom, but I thought we would just look at them. Now, these are examples that are from week 5, like the very end of class. So everything has been really, resolved at this point. So just keep that in mind that your particular characters at this point do not have to look as polished as this. But one of the things that we can really learn from these particular designs is just how simple the background really needs to become in order for the character to look like a character to stand out. In general, like when we call something a background, we call it a background because it is like a backdrop or a background or a negative space where there's not usually as much going on. And that's true for any design you really make, is that you always want to think of the foreground, which is what you want people to be, seeing as the focal point, and then, the background, which is where is your kind of, it's just supposed to be secondary. But I think it's even more important in this particular type of project, I've learned, because the character itself is made out of objects that you're putting together. And each of those objects becomes a character, which, we want it to become a character and look like a character, but it's still each of those objects still looks like one of the objects. Like these still look like chili peppers and orange slices and a little lettuce leaf. So it becomes more important for the background to be simple, really simple, because of the fact that these are all objects. And if you put them on something that's like kind of complicated or a little bit busy, or what happens is that the character starts just blending into the background. It becomes a group of objects. We can't see it clearly as being a character, like a unified um, character anymore. So that's one of the reasons why it's so important, I have found. Um, okay, some things to keep in mind with the background is that you can have objects, like this one has a little apple here, but notice how it's off to the side. It's like we're not even seeing the whole thing. It's off to the side. So behind the character, it's very, very simple. This one just, has a crumpled piece of paper, so it's really just very simple texture, doesn't have a lot of details, so it also works as a background. This one here is actually kind of very misty, almost foggy looking. I think the student who did this did a lot of blurring, kind of selective blurring of the photograph, trying to really kind of make it simple, but you still see a little bit of detail, but it doesn't get in the way. This one is very kind of blurred in places, but there's these little raindrops that, give it a little detail, but still allow the character to stand out. This is just, in general, you want to have a photograph. This student actually went with a kind of a vectory background, and I thought it worked really well for a character. So I thought, hey, I think it's okay. It still has it gives it a lot of context for the character. But in general, you do want to work with a photograph. This one is probably the most detailed, um, and it works pretty well because the photograph itself is darker. Even though it has more detail, it's darker, and the character is kind of more saturated and a little lighter, so it stands out. So you kind of want to, again, it's like about playing with things, but you know, a lot of times like close-ups really work. Like you can see that a few of these are based on close-up backgrounds, like where we zoom in. So you want to create context in the sense of like a sense of space, like the kind of the counter with the fruit, or the kind of the sort of little rainy garden, or the paper for garbage dump Dan, or the grill, the stage. You want that sense of context, but think about how you can do it in the simplest way possible. Like maybe you just need like a little hint of something happening there. So like a really big scene with a lot of detail, a lot going on won't work for your character. It's all about trying to figure out ways. Maybe it's blurring, maybe it's close-ups, maybe it's just very sort of simple texture that somehow brings your character to life. Okay, Dwight. Yes, I like that idea that you have of creating your character as if it's flying, so it looks like um, you've moved the shadow down below, so it looks like it's floating. I think that's an awesome idea. And yeah, and I love the colors that you're creating. You've got a lot of these sort of pastel-y colors. We'll talk more about colors next week when we start working with color corrections in our classroom in a book exercise. So we're going to apply what we know into our character. But something to think about for that, and this is a kind of a general comment for everybody to look ahead, is what colors do you like best in your character? For example, in your character here, Dwight, you've got a lot of kind of oranges and yellows and reds. And so you can, but that doesn't mean you have to keep those colors. In Photoshop, there's quite a lot of flexibility to change colors of elements. And so what you can do is you can use a certain color palette and change everything else to match that. And that makes a really nice sort of harmonious design. So you can pick 2 or 3 major color groups. So maybe everything's going to be orange, yellow, and red. And those are the colors you're going to just change everything else to match. So don't worry about that for now, but just, keep that in mind for the future. Okay, so just a comment about your character. So we'll also talk about this a little more next week, but something you can start thinking about is how you might add a little movement to your character. So if your character's flying, how, maybe it's like some of the wings are in different positions, maybe the head, if you can sort of imagine like what would it look like if somebody's floating around flapping their wings, maybe their legs are in different positions. So just to kind of give it a little more movement, that will really bring your character to life. So just some things you can start, again, you don't have to worry necessarily about, you could start working on the movement at this point. I think that would look nice because you're working with the cast shadow already, and that will mimic it. So it actually is not a bad idea to start thinking about that now. Okay, so you've got your text here too, which I think is working. I might work with, I love the arc, because it floats. I think that's really nice. I might think about maybe making your text a little heavier, like what we call like a larger footprint in design. And what that just means is like the text itself will take up a little more space. Like maybe it's bold, like you can add a bold to it, you can make it bigger. It just seems like it's a little bit light considering, if you look at your character, you've got a lot of bulk in your character, which is good. I think that's really nice, have a lot of solidity. And so maybe your text should follow along with that. Your background, I love the background choice in terms of just this whole kind of strewn bits of, sort of sparkles and candy and stuff. I'm a little concerned that behind the character it's getting a little lost, but there's ways we can actually fix that. Maybe we'll do that. Maybe we'll experiment with your background now. But one thing I'm a little concerned about is I notice here that this background, even if you worked with this background, it's a little kind of blurry in here. Can you see that? It's like right in here. Maybe the focal point is here. So, and then it gets blurrier there. So it might be a little hard to work with this photo because of the blurring, and we can blur intentionally. And what I usually recommend, well, I'll show you how I generally like to blur things for this project. But again, I would sort of maybe think about maybe if you can find another photograph that's more in focus, especially at the bottom. So what we can do is, so in real life, if you were to take a photograph of your character, or a person or anything in real life, like you took a photograph, what generally happens, and what we often want to enhance in photography, is that we want our character to be in focus, and we often want our background to be blurred. There's a couple reasons for that. One is that it just throws more attention onto our character, or a person, or whatever object you're photographing. The other thing it does is it mimics the way we actually really look at things in the real world. Like if you look around in your room, maybe you put your hand in front of your face, and you look and you focus on your hand. I'm doing that right now. And everything behind that will be out of focus. That's just, you know, the way our eyes see. So that's another one of the reasons that in photography, even though in photography, you actually can get everything in focus, like foreground and background, but in general, we often want the background out of focus. So those are the two reasons. It mimics reality, but it also puts more attention on our character. So let's actually use this background, because I think it might be useful for other folks to see this, if you don't mind me using your character as an example. So what we would do is, what I like to do is, I've done this already, I like to duplicate the layer. Now you can also use something called Smart Objects for the layer, but I find it actually easier to duplicate a layer just by, you know, grabbing it, you know, and dragging it to this little, the layer down here that duplicates it. I'm now going to duplicate it 3 times. So that's okay. That way I'm going to turn off one of these layers, and now I've got a copy in my file. So now I'm going to edit this, and I'm actually going to edit it destructively, but I've backed up these copies here now. So if I don't like it, I can always go back to that one. So if you go up to the filter menu, right up here, it's above the video, I apologize, but it's the filter menu. There's something called a blur gallery in here. Photoshop actually has a lot of different ways to blur. Many, many, many different, well, quite a few, and they keep adding more because it's a real popular thing that people want to blur. And you can experiment with all of these. I tend to, for this particular method, I tend to either use field or iris, because what I want to do is I just want to blur a part of the photograph. And so let's just do iris. And what we want to do is we want to blur up here and under the feet of the character, where normally it would be in focus in reality if you had a camera. I want to keep this in focus. So this in focus and this blurred. So how you do it is you actually add these. So I'm going to start by just blurring the whole thing quite a lot. And, well, actually, and so then what you can do is this little center part here, which is in focus. So I'm going to blur as much as I want this background to be. That's pretty good. Can you see what it does? It actually is really quite beautiful, because it creates a kind of a subtle color wash that actually is very nice behind a character. And then, and of course, you can still add adjustment layers on top of the blur if you want to change it later, the colors. So it's perfectly flexible. And this little circle here, you can see this little circle here, we're in the center here, so it's going to be in focus. But this circle here, what it does is it's sort of, the more you do it, the more blurred it gets. Now what we're going to do is we're going to actually drag this little pin down here where we want it to be in focus. And as I said, we want it to be in focus under the feet, because that's normally where your camera is aimed at the character when you take a picture, so the character is in focus and everything around it is going to also be in focus. And so now we can take this little, we're going to zoom here like this. I'm going to kind of go quite a lot here, and you can see that what it's doing is it's sort of creating this blur where I wanted to. Now one thing that's happening here, you can see, is that the transition here between the blur and the so I'm thinking, and I'm also, so the transition here is quite dramatic, and we want to maybe soften that, and that's where we can pull these little lines down, and that kind of creates more of a softer transition point between the blurred and the not blurred areas. So you can actually really play with this. I'm going to just kind of maybe pull this up a bit more and maybe pull this down. So you can see that maybe just under its feet it's going to be in focus. And then it's kind of blurring along these edges here a little bit. And so I'm going to maybe actually pull this out a little bit more. So you can kind of, you just got to play with this until you learn how it works. But if I pull this out, then more of this side is going to stay in focus. Okay? So, so this actually makes this photo look a lot better in terms of just the visual properties and how it works with your character. But again, you can maybe consider another. One thing I noticed is that there was actually more, when I looked at your photograph, your background photograph really carefully, I noticed there was more in focus up here, so you could sort of move it down and play with it if you really love this photo. But just keep in mind that I noticed again that this was a little bit blurry, and so it kind of maybe, yeah, took away from it. But you'll notice when I did that, I'm sorry, if you go back in the recording, how it even made the text look better by blurring the background. Okay, I think that's it. So, oh, I noticed too just some very small things, but I might as well get them done now. I noticed there's a little line here. You see there's some lines here. That's again, remember we talked about this last week with, I think it may be, it's either from the marshmallow or here. It's so your layer mask. So if you, we looked at how to erase these lines last week in the critique. So I would just look at that and see if you can erase that. Okay, all right, and I think that's looking good. Let me know if you have any questions. Hi, Kayla. All right, so Garden Glitter Grace. Yeah, I think this looks really good. Your characters really come along nicely, and you've got some nice glittery text. And so you're working with some clouds in the background. Yeah, I think that's a nice choice for Garden Glitter Grace. She's floating up in the clouds. And yeah, so I would say just for the background, I might just keep experimenting a little bit more with the clouds. Maybe you could blur a little bit of the clouds out, maybe at the bottom, or, like the clouds up here are really quite pretty, but do we need to see clouds behind all of her? Or could we maybe blur some out so to kind of like emphasize the character a little bit more? And the reason why maybe I'll contrary to the previous design we looked at where the character was standing on the ground, because your character is floating around in the clouds, it really doesn't matter where you blur. I was actually thinking behind here because then that would really help your text stand out a little bit more, and also the feet, which are getting a little lost. So you might experiment with that a little bit more. Something else I noticed is that your character is very symmetrical. You notice that it's like standing completely symmetrical in the space, the hands are at the same place, the feet are at the same place. In general, when you start moving towards symmetry, you usually want everything to be symmetrical. So like instead of the text being on one side, you would put it like perfectly placed above or below, perfectly in the center. Maybe you'd put it, to fit it in, you'd put it on one, line. The background, you try to center it too, so that like the background is very symmetrical, like the clouds look exactly sort of the same, or pretty close to the same. So that's something to think about. If you don't want everything to be symmetrical, then what you want to do is just experiment with the character, moving it away from symmetry, like maybe the wings would be in different places, and the arms and the legs. You can do all kinds of things like tilting the head. I kind of do recommend this in general for people just to bring the character to life, but it's not, like if you like the symmetrical quality, that is something you've really liked about your character, then I would just make everything symmetrical. I'm sorry that face didn't go along, but just to kind of give you an idea of how you can start, moving things around. It's just, what you do is you just kind of look at the way the human body, how do we often pose, and you just let your character follow along. Okay, so that's what I'd recommend here, the main thing, but I would just say that the text and the feet are a wee bit hard to see right now, and again, you can experiment with different ways to fix that. Like if you, the feet, you could either like simplify the background behind the feet or blur it out, or you could add some adjustment layers to, darken or lighten the color a little bit of the feet. Looks like you've added a little glow around the feet, which was probably your desire to make the feet stand out a little bit more. I would probably say to remove the glow, like any of the glow around it, and use adjustment layers to change the color or change the contrast to the background, because I think it looks a little strange to have glow around the feet and not anywhere else. And I actually don't know if you, I would probably just, yeah, I would probably just remove the glow and again experiment with more contrast. So that's it. You know, you're like, again, you know, I give a lot of feedback at this stage because there's usually a lot of things that need to be balanced out, but you know, this is a good stage to be at basically, where all you're doing is just sort of playing with the different elements you have and just refining them and moving them around until it's, you know, you really get your character just really, you know, really come to life and all of the kind of various design challenges smoothed out. So yeah, just keep working. Okay, Christy, I'm just reading through your comments here. Okay. All right, yeah, so yeah, I think your character looks really cute on the beach, and I love the way you've worked on the lighting. And again, it's really lovely here, how you've worked with all of these adjustment layers. Is the amazing part of adjustment layers is that they are, you know, very versatile and also continually updatable. You can always go back and edit them. Yeah, so, and I really like your background and your text. I think that looks really good for your character, the way, and your also your shadows here. That looks really nice. So I would say just maybe a couple things here. So I might do what I've suggested to earlier with maybe blurring out the background a little bit. You know, you could blur it enough so that you can sort of still see a little bit of what's happening here, but you could, you know, kind of make it, again, recede a little more, and again, that would really bring more attention to your character. So that's probably the main thing I would do here. Yeah, you know, something you could think about too is maybe how the color of your text works with the design. Like you've got the yellow here, which I think picks up a little bit on this color here, but this color here, like the peachy color, I don't see anywhere else in the design. So something you might think about is how can you tie this color, the peachy color, into the turtle, or maybe you would turn this color into maybe a greenish color to match the turtle, or you know, you'd go from like this darker color here to maybe the lighter green here, or the lighter color in the croissant here on the head, you know, so you can kind of tie that together. Yeah, okay, that's, I think, the main thing here. I think everything else looks really good. You're at a good stage here right now with your design. So we'll just experiment just a little bit more with the photograph and the text. Hi, Mackay. Okay, yeah. So you mentioned that you were thinking that maybe you needed to experiment with more texture in your name. And I don't know. I actually think that this works pretty well for your character. You have a lot of texture in the rest of the design, and you don't necessarily want to necessarily overwhelm the design with too much. So I do actually think just the simple text actually contrasts pretty nicely, and yet it also has, I think, a strong modern look, which I think suits your character. You know, I think it really works well with your character. And yeah, and you mentioned you wanted maybe a darker background, but then the legs wouldn't stand out. Yes, that's absolutely right. I think it's a good choice to, you know, go with something that will contrast your character, especially the legs, which are quite light. So I think you're just on the verge right now, I think, of losing your legs, so I don't think you'd want to go more textured or detailed in the background. And I think it's working. I think that background works, and I like the kind of you know, it looks like the character is in some kind of loft studio, maybe practicing, or you know, in a practice space or something like that. I think it works. I also think your shadow looks really good. It really, you know, you can really see in your case how the shadow very much enhances the sense of space and 3 dimensions in the design, because we really get a sense of how far away the character is from the background, from the wall. I think that looks really good. And I think your colors are working pretty well as well. You've got like these kind of muted, kind of cool grayish colors, and then you've got some organic colors in here, and then a simple sort of creamy background. I think they all work well together. And your text, you know, so I'm talking a little bit more about your color here because I think you're at the stage to think a little bit more about that. And you're using a blue here, which you know, in general, I always think about colors in terms of, you always want to have color that picks up in somewhere else in the design. So if you have blue here, you maybe would want to have blue somewhere else. But I don't know, in your case, I think the blue is working pretty well. You've got these little eyes here that on your microphone. Let me just zoom in here a little bit. And you could, and again, I wouldn't worry about it for this week, since I really like to focus a little bit more on color next week, since that's part of our classroom in a book exercise. But you could, for these eyes, you could turn them blue. Just use an adjustment layer on top. Go to adjustment layers, go to hue and saturation, and clip that layer, and then sometimes you can just really do something yeah, so something really fast and easy like that, and then match that color, so that ties it in. Or the opposite thing is, if you like that red eye, then you could turn the stroke around your letters red. You could just bring that in, just tie it together. Color theory is very similar how you might do color somewhere else. For example, in matching outfits, oftentimes in clothing, we might match one thing to another. And in home decor, like in your living room or something, you might try to have something that has a certain, like maybe a bit of color in your rug that matches a color on your sofa, or a throw pillow or something like that. It's the same principle of just tying things in together. Okay, all right, yeah, that's it. I think you're just a few things to think about here. You're going in a really good direction. Okay, Dimitri, yes, a stage is a great thing for this character to use. Other students have done something similar with this character in previous classes, and I do think it's a great idea because, first of all, the stage is such a simple, usually like backdrop, like naturally it is quite simple. Let me just sort of zoom in here a little bit. Okay, yeah, so let's see here. So, um, so I'm a little, the only thing that I'm hesitating a little bit about with the background, with the stage, is how much pattern is going on back here. Um, it's not bad, but if you can find an even simpler stage, I think that could be better. I mean, if you go into Google Images, there's a ton of stages. So you might want to keep experimenting with that just to see if you can find something simpler behind the character. I do like the floorboards, though. I think they're really, really beautiful, and they work pretty well under the feet. But maybe the background could be a little bit simpler. I think your text style looks really good. I think that's a really nice choice. For the color of your text, think about maybe how you could match something in your design that would tie it in. Again, it's something we'll talk more about. And I don't have this. Do I have this text? No, I don't think I do. But it's pretty. So let's see if I can still modify it. Hold on a second. I don't think I can, but what you can do with the text is you can match it to something in your design. You have white here, you've got the yellow in the background, you've got the orange stripes, or like kind of a gray color, whatever whatever color you want to start matching things in the design. Yeah, those are the main things. I like, the direction your character's taking now. I love the more of the movement in your design. It's starting to bring it to life a little bit more. Let me just zoom in here. Maybe I might experiment with making the arms maybe a little bit bigger. When you zoom out, they're getting a little lost. So I might make them a little bit bigger. Or sometimes when you simplify the background, sometimes those details will naturally start to be more obvious. But yeah, you know, I think that's looking good. You could still even experiment even a little more with movement in your character, you know, thinking about maybe the head would tilt a little bit, or you know, your legs, then maybe he's kicking one of his legs up or gesturing in some way. You know, you can kind of sort of play around with different parts of the design just to, again, to bring it more to life. So yeah, I think that's about it. Um, I might also see, maybe make your character a little bit bigger. It still feels a little bit, maybe a little small in the page. Like maybe you could crop a little bit of this side, just to, again, to emphasize your character a little bit more by bringing it, um, giving it more of of the space to inhabit. I won. Yes, you know, masking, yeah, it was what we did last week, and it's something that I think it's always a little challenging. I'm glad you were able to do that. It looks really, look, your masks are all in place here. Let me just zoom in here so we can see them all here, which is great. Nice job with that. And I'm so glad that you also were able to get your project in for the group critique. 'Cause we always, in the group critique, we always have a chance to do a lot more um, discussion and you know, really cover a lot more. Okay, so your character, I'm going to zoom in a little bit here so we can see your character a little bit. So this is Flippin' Food Fred. Yeah, I think Flippin' Food Fred's looking good. Um, I love the hat, the hair at the top, the pineapple hat. Um, and I might kind of play a little bit more on how you place it in there. It feels like maybe it could go a little upwards. You know, it doesn't, it feels like it, you know what I mean? Like it's like the edge here is a little too tight along its head, like maybe it needs to go up a little bit. So you might play with that a little bit more. Might work a little bit more on masking the arms a little bit, playing with these edges a little bit more to see if you can just mask them a little bit more. Right here, those little white edges. Um, I don't think we did this in last week's group critique here, but sometimes you can get Photoshop to fix that for you with just a little help. So in here, here's the layer mask here. If we double click on that, and then, hold on just a second here. Yeah, so in the properties area, what you can do is just go over this area. Automatically you get the edge detection tool when you're in this area, and anywhere there's a little bit of white, that's the background showing, you can go over it. You can actually adjust this tool as well with the bracket tools on your keyboard. So left bracket makes it smaller, right makes it bigger. So I'd make it a little smaller, and you just want to pass over these areas just one time and see if Photoshop can pick up a little bit of the white. And it is. It's also it's also actually picking a little bit, well, you know, it's a little bit of, you have to sacrifice a little bit. It's like, it's kind of making little bits transparent, but that's going to be okay later. It's better to get rid of this. So you can see that Photoshop is just figuring out where those edges are. You see that? So you can go through here anywhere in there that you've got some white, and is this white in there? I think that's part of the, yeah, I think that's part of the, you only want to do this one time, generally make one pass over something. If you go again, I'll try to do this again, see if I can make it do this. It's not bad. Sometimes if you do it more than once, it'll start really getting the image blurry. It'll start making it very transparent. It's doing a little bit there, but that should be okay. Anyhow, so that's how you can easily fix that area using the Photoshop tool. Okay, so let's zoom out a little bit more. So yeah, so I would clean up your masks, and so with your layout here, I think this background, I think it's probably going to work. It's like simple, although there is a lot of texture. So you may still need to do some playing with it, but I think it could work. I'm a little more concerned about the text. I think the text style is really nice, but having the text spread out in different places can make it hard to read, and also is taking up a lot of the space of your design. And I'd like to see your character take maybe a little more space up because it's quite thin. And I'd like to sort of, you know, get your character really filling out the space a bit more. So I would probably do something as I like the inventiveness of spreading it in different places, but I think probably just putting it, you know, in your case, you could maybe run it up the side, the whole thing, like take Flippin' Food Fred and take it and just turn it 90 degrees. I'm going to do it very roughly. There's a way to do this a little more accurately when you do it, when you rotate it, but I'm going to do it very, just kind of put it there. And then I would take, and then I would put all of your other text here and just maybe line it up the side. And the reason why I'm suggesting this for you, you might have to make it a little smaller to get it to fit, but the reason why I'm suggesting it for you is because you've got this very long, narrow design, you know, and so I think it would be good to fit your text there. And then I would also just take this text and just make it horizontal and just like, so Flippin' Food Fred would be all the way up here. Does that make sense? I think that could work really well in your design. And then what you could do is you could take your character, make it a little taller and fill the space and move it over to the right a little bit. I think that would look really good. So those are some of the main things. I still think you could experiment a little bit more with your character. I'm not 100% sure about what's happening here. It feels a little busy. I might kind of maybe experiment, maybe just, you know, maybe taking some of the elements off. Do you need all of this, or would it work without all of these details on top? I kind of think it might. Like it would start reading as a head and a character without all of the little added details on top. Sometimes little tiny pieces in the character can be hard to read. So that's it. So those are the main things. I think you've got some good elements. We can talk more next week about like the color, but I think that just resolving the space a little bit more and cleaning up the layer mess is the direction to go in. I think that would go a long way to, you know, really taking your design to the next level. Okay, Wintrice. Let me just get rid of this. So, yeah, so I'm also glad you were able to submit your assignment for the group critique. It's just really, you know, we can do so much work in the group critique, and, you know, you get a lot of feedback on your assignment. So, yeah, keep it up. Keep it up. Aim to get in. This is true for everybody. Just really do try as much as you can, even if your assignment you don't feel is completely done, like you want to do more work on it, but the deadline is due. It's always good to hand in because it is a draft stage. So you may know that you can do more to it, but hand it in. That way you can get some feedback, and then you can keep working on it with that feedback. Because if you miss the group critique, then I can give you some textual feedback, which I can do a lot in that too. But I think it's much better to do it here. Okay, so for your character, yeah, I think your character, let's just zoom in here in your character. I think your character is coming along really nicely. I love the chef hat. I think that adds a lot of character. And, you know, it's interesting how the cherries are starting to look like little hearts, which is really cute. So I think that's working pretty well. We could probably maybe talk more about it later on, but I would really like to spend a little bit more time talking about the background. I love the idea of having an artistic background, if that artistic background is really quite simple. And I feel like this background is maybe a little, so it's maybe a little bit too detailed. Like even just turning off that, and I understand why you did what you did. What you did is you actually erased everything behind the character. That's a very smart move. Like it's like exactly what you want to be doing is to simplify the background around your character. But I think it doesn't maybe go the whole way of resolving that. So I'm going to turn this off, and I'm going to suggest maybe to keep looking for a background here that maybe is a little, you know, even a little simpler. And thinking about, so you've got Flippin' Food Fred. So you want to just make it Flippin' Food Fred. So you want to take the graphite out, because when a client gives us a name, as designers, we can do a lot of creative things, but we can't change their name, their product name. That's like something that is just, they've invented it. So you're almost there. You just want to take out the graphite, and yeah, so take out the graphite and then experiment a little bit more with your background. think about like Flippin' Food Fred. Where would Flippin' Food Fred be? You know, maybe on a counter, in front of a wall, a kitchen, maybe on you know, in a frying pan or a grill, you know, something, but something simple, like a simple background. But it can be like a little, like something like a close-up. And then maybe, and I always recommend experimenting with a number of different backgrounds, but to give it more context so that, you know, you're really building the context of who Flippin' Food Fred is, you know, through the background. I think that's the most important thing here. You've got these, look, can you see all these white outlines around all of your elements? We talked about how to fix those last week in the group critique. So I don't want to repeat doing that here because it takes a bit of time, but it's not hard to fix. And we went through the solution last week in the group critique. If you you just go back in there and review it, you'll find it. It's really actually pretty fun to learn how to do it because it gets you working in the masks. So I'd like you to remove all those white lines, and it's all done through the layer mask. And yeah, that's the main thing. And then I would also just make your character a little bit bigger. It's like it's a little bit lost in the design. So, you know, maybe make it a little bit, come down a little further, you know, maybe up a little further. Maybe your text could be in one line of text instead of taking up so much room on the side so that your character doesn't have room to go upwards. So kind of experiment with that space. Again, you know, we always want to make sure that everything is supporting our character to really make your character pop, just really be the center piece of your design. All right, so that's what I'd like you to work on just a little bit more. Jaden, yeah, I agree. I love this text. I think it's a really good choice. The font works well with your idea of Garbage Dump Dan. For your background, I think this is starting to really move towards the right idea here. I would love if you used a photograph rather than a vector image. This to me looks like it's part of a vector style. So think about maybe getting a real image, you know, of a photograph, I should say. Who had, I think it was Mackay, who had the brick wall with the wood flooring, you know, so they're out there, you know, like a really good brick images. So I might experiment with that. You know, we're really trying to work with Photoshop itself to build things. So the background, I think it really helps if it's like an actual room or a wall or something like that. So that will also, I think, help with the texture back here is when you have texture in a background, you have to be pretty careful about the texture because the texture itself really draws the eye because it has so much detail. And so when we work with the background, we're trying to balance the texture with it trying to be a background, like a really recede. So when you look for something, you know, you want to kind of keep that in mind. We can also do things like blur the background as well. So if you find a brick wall that you really love with a lot of texture, we can experiment with that. But that's the first thing I would do is work on the background. With your character, I'd like to talk a little bit more about your character. So I know you love this element in here. This, I'm not quite sure what it is now. I think it was originally something that you hang in your car, those scent strips. But it's really hard to tell what it is. And it's really nice, I think. And I'm also feeling too, like with the head, that it's the whole head probably could stand to be tweaked a little bit. Like a lot of these elements, you've done such a wonderful job at masking them, but they're not quite reading as objects at this point. They look like something that's hard to understand. So maybe keep experimenting here with this whole head area. Think about what you might use in place of these elements to create the head. You know, really use a little bit of, you know, imagination, and I'm sure you'll come up with something good. The same thing with this element here. This is also a little bit hard to understand what it is, although it's, once I zoom in, it's a lot better. I'm starting to see the detail, you know, that it's, I think it was, yeah, some kind of car piece. So I wouldn't worry about that, maybe leave that for now. But then I would also think about how to make it look more like a character. I like the idea of arms, but what about putting an arm on this side as well? So it's got two arms rather than, it's, you know, right now it's missing an arm, so it doesn't look quite as character-like as it could. So maybe kind of experiment with that. More arm, like another arm here. I would try to keep it symmetrical, so if you add another arm, make it the same arm. Yeah, those are some of the things I'd work with a little bit more. Once you get your background, a new background, maybe think about too placing your text. Well, yep. Let's see. See where it goes. Like this, your text could probably. I'm a little concerned that it's a little small now. It's a little hard to read. Part of that is because the contrast between the background and the. So if we take this off, it's starting to be. Can you see? It's a lot easier to read. I think that's partly because the background and the text are so close in color. So maybe a simpler background with a contrasting color would help. All right, so in terms of your color, I think your color is really looking pretty good. I love the idea of keeping it kind of neutral with all of the grays. I think that'll work really well with maybe touches of red or an accent color. So I would just keep going with that. Hey, Walter, all right. Yeah, I think your pale looks really great, and I can understand why you want to call it a pale kid. Just like I mentioned before, you do really want to make sure that you are using the name that Eclipse Entertainment gave us in week 1. So was it Garbage Dump Dan or Don? I don't remember, but that's what you want to put here, is the name of your character. Okay. Something else I'd like you to keep working on a little bit more is your character design. There's still a sense of it not quite being a character. It's hard to identify what the character is. So, for example, maybe is this going to be the mouth right here? This element? Maybe? So maybe it needs to, kind of sit more like a mouth, something like that. The carrot, maybe the carrot's going to be an arm. It looks like maybe it got cut off a little bit, so you might want to bring that photograph back in, or maybe that's actually maybe the photograph itself. So maybe find a photograph. Yeah, so a photograph, maybe you can use this carrot instead of the other carrot. But in any case, I know you took a lot of photographs yourself, which is great, but I would, make it easier on yourself and just find the photographs on the internet, like through Google Images. But in any case, you could sort of take this arm, duplicate it, and then just bring it over to the other side, whatever photograph you end up with, so that now you have 2 arms, so now we can start going, oh yeah, look, it's a character, it's got arms. You could, do the same thing with the bucket, like make the bucket a little smaller. It looks like maybe it's going to cut off as well, but, make it a little smaller, put some legs or something on there that you could have for, feet, and then you can start, so you see how we can start building, making it look a little more like a character, all right? So those are some of the things I'd work on a little bit more. I think you've got a little bit more work to do here with your character design. So maybe spend a little bit of time with this week working on that. And next week we'll talk a little bit more maybe about some of the layer masks and maybe the background. Once you get your character name in there, maybe think a little bit more about your concept as your character's developed. I think your background it's simple. I like the gradient. It could work for another type of assignment. For this particular assignment, it's good to have a background that is photographic and that also gives you a sense of character for your design. But leave that to the side for now. I'd like you to just maybe focus on the things we've talked about with the character design and the text. And then next week we'll take it from there and maybe do a little more work with those parts. Okay, Terry. Yeah, for the shadow, that's not a requirement for the assignment. You can sort of decide whether you want to do one or not. But I think that, so what I might suggest at this point in your design is maybe work on a few other elements before the shadow. Like you want to make sure that you have your text for your, design your text. It looks like you want to add that. And then I would keep experimenting with your background. I love the idea of sort of the mysterious kind of background, with this, the garbage truck coming along. But I think it's maybe a little too busy for your design. Can you see how when I turn it off, how suddenly your design really, we really see your character. But when we turn it on, it gets a little lost. Now this is something, I think this happens a lot in design. It happens to me all the time, where when I'm working on something, I know what it is I'm working on because I've looked at it for a while. I'm the one who's built it. So when I add something else, I don't necessarily see what other people see. And I think it's especially true when you add a background, that you're not looking at through the more of an objective view. So when you add this background, you think, hey, it looks great. I know what the character is and I can identify all the parts of the character. But somebody else looking at it, they may might be confusing. So I keep experimenting, like maybe keep brainstorming, like what else could you add? Maybe just an empty street, you know, where Garbage Dump Dan is just hanging out on an empty street, you know, so you don't have like a light, like you don't have a truck or all those lights, but something interesting but just simple. You know, maybe sort of like a kind of a empty, lonely street or something at night, because it looks like you've got a nighttime, you know, photograph here. So keep experimenting. Maybe find a handful of photographs, put them behind your character, and just experiment and see which one works best. So that's the thing I would work on a little bit more here, is designing your text and working on your background. I noticed that maybe your Apple II here, you have a little bit of layer mask. There's still a little bit of issues here with your layer mask. I'm going to turn these eyes off here for a minute. Oh, so it looks like this, I think we talked about this a few times previously. This Apple, I think you need a new Apple. It's got a lot of issues here with something looks like it got kind of, the file got corrupted or little pieces got taken out. So I know you can find a lot better one just in Google Images. So I'd keep looking here for something, and that'll probably make it a lot easier to mask, so you won't have a lot of these issues going on. So just use that technique we did in Google Images, where we went into Google Images and we found photographs of using the, well, let's actually just do that here so you can see in case you've forgotten. Hold on a second here. Okay, so here we are in Google Images, and of course you can use other sources. I use Google Images these days because they've got a lot of tools that I find really helpful. So for example, size, we're going to go larger than 1024 by 768. That way we know it's high resolution. You'll notice that when we open this up, we get a lot of illustration and drawing, which we want to try to not have to wade through so much of that, even though, so we go to photo, and then we can maybe we can find something that works a little bit better, you know, so you can kind of go through here and see if you can find one. Now some of these, like when you go through these, you'll really notice a lot of these are not professionally photographed. It's one of the downsides of Google Images, is that, you know, some of these look like snapshots, but so look for kind of ones that you might imagine being in it's okay, might like be in a magazine, like that kind of sense of being really a good quality image. And the thing with an Apple core, I'm just going to say now too, with the thing with an Apple core that makes it challenging is when I've worked with apples, when I've, you know, my experience with apples is that they get kind of brown and yucky really quickly. So that's one of the things. So you got to try to get an apple that's nice and fresh. And if you have problems with that, you know what? Change it to something else. You know, I think your character could easily have a different object for the head. So don't worry if you need to make a change. Maybe even something that's rounder that could look like a head. Why not? You know, be bold when you're, if this is something for everybody. If there's something in your design at this point that just doesn't feel right, change it. You know, you go with your intuition. And, you know, see if there's something else that you can, sometimes just removing an element and trying something else is all that it needs. Hi, Alyssa. Thanks so much for trying to upload your file again. Yeah, there's definitely, you know, we have these big files, and it does make it hard when we upload. And there's something about the classroom. I've been running into this problem the last few sessions where it's just not working that well. I've been asking folks to send me, I may do that again. I may post an announcement and ask people to send me files in another method because I am having problems downloading them, and I don't know why. I've been working with the school on it. But in any case, thanks for uploading it again. Sometimes it just requires a second try. Yeah, so your background, I agree with you that maybe it's a little too busy. The thing to, you know, decide is what do you want for your background? You know, because that way when you start searching for it, it can really make it easier. Like, for example, you look like you want to have, maybe some kind of something with the garden, like maybe a garden path. That's awfully cute, the idea of a path. And then when you search, you want to search for really simple backgrounds. So like, for example, garden path. Let's see if we can do something in Google Images. So what I would look for, if I were looking for a garden path, is I would look for the path part as being the most important. And I'd want, oh, that's not bad. And I'd kind of want to edit out a lot of the other parts around it, because your character here is made out of garden elements. You know what I mean? Like, it's got all of these garden elements, and if you put garden elements around it like you do, then the parts of your character starts blending in. So something super simple. And one of the benefits also of using a large a large resolution file is that you can oftentimes you can expand it, like you can make it bigger. So like, for example, again, I don't know if this is the right choice or not, but like, so you could take and just use a little section of it. Do you know what I mean? Is there watermarks on there? Yeah, it looks like there's a can you see there's a tiny watermark there? So yeah, there it is. So I would skip that, but you know what I mean? Like, or maybe, so now, like, and also getting ideas here. So I'm sort of getting ideas, like maybe some kind of like decorative pavement, which be really pretty, or, kind of, again, sort of going through sort of, sometimes you can get other ideas. But that's what I would do here. I'd keep experimenting, maybe even download 3 or 4 backgrounds, put them in there. Don't hesitate to move them around, make them bigger, kind of see, maybe blur parts out, see if you can find something that might work. So like in your particular, like even in your photograph here, let's see. And sometimes when you do this, I'm going to hold down the shift key. Sometimes when you do this, it really depends a lot on the size of the file, whether you can get away with this without it pixelating. But you can, just to give you an idea here of really zooming in. Yeah, it's a little pixelated, but you can see, how now your character really comes to life with that simple background. So that's what I'd work on a little bit more. That's the main thing I'd work on, is playing with the background. Your text, yeah, I like this text. I think it's working. I might experiment maybe with taking off some of the effects. Maybe just keep the drop shadow, or it's a little hard to read, but maybe just the drop shadow. Maybe soften it up, maybe a little less black in it. But yeah, maybe make it a bit bigger to your text so it stands out a little bit more. Okay, that's what I'd work on a little bit more. Just finding that perfect background. Once you do, it really will resolve a lot of the other challenges you might have in your design. So that's what I'd start with first.